Hi, everyone. Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining us. This is our latest live stream history program where we're going to be talking about the difficult but important subject of white supremacy. And this is actually the first of a two-part series that our good friend Edward is going to be hosting for us. The second one is going to be the same time next week if you're watching us live. And with that, oh, and just by the way, we're also recording this program. It'll be available on our YouTube channel either later. It probably won't be posted till tomorrow, but I'll send out the link for that if you have to drop off early, or if you want to watch it again, or if you know anyone else that would be interested in checking it out. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to our good friend Edward. Edward, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon in Washington, D.C. time. A special thank you to D.C. Culture and History that makes these presentations possible. Our topic today is a complicated one, and I make no apologies for that. There's a lot to cover, and it may sound like a lecture, and I will tell you, you're perfectly free to do what my students would do and pull out your phone and text somebody else or go off and take a walk. And I will try and keep my remarks today to about an hour and a half, and I may pause about 45 minutes through just to kind of give everyone a chance to think about it. I'll explain things as we go along. This is the first of two webinars that will track colonial white supremacy from 1790, and we'll talk about why white is in quotations later. From supremacy from 1790 and the first Congress of the United States through the collusion of politics and violence in the January 6th, 2020 coup. All this will not be done today. This is 2 weeks. The first presentation begins like Star Wars, in a world far, far away across the sea, when the need for empire, fueled by greed and justified by Enlightenment philosophies, provided an excuse for race dominance. The question could be asked, and I ask the schools where I teach continental ethics, why this philosophy is still the mainstay of first-year colleges across the US. Perhaps because, as the events of the last weeks demonstrate, empire is still being made at profound and irreversible costs to people who suffer it. I'm going to pause here for a moment to acknowledge the suffering in Ukraine. Here's what we'll do today. First, an introduction on fake news. And then actually three sections. There's four, but I think I'm going to wait for the fourth till next week. So what we'll cover today is, what is white supremacy? Nothing personal. It's a theory of history. Colonialism and the modern nation state, and that's an important kind of concept to think about. I don't think we think about it very often because we're not given the possibilities of doing that through our media. And finally, global white, the eye of the colonial. So first, what is white supremacy? Actually, first, what is fake news? What is fake news, really? One, it's operatic, screeching and wailing and finger pointing. Two, in always familiar scenes and situations. And three, fake news assures that nothing will change. But the subject that should be addressed remains hidden, obscured from the Latin obscura, offstage. This is the real fake news. How real fake news works. Personalize, blame, and deflect. Father, mothers, kids, children. White supremacists defend. White supremacists, nationalism, not globalism. Defend ourselves and our posterity. But the issue is not the obvious at which fingers are pointed and voices are raised. Pay no attention to the delivery system. Look instead for the structure supporting and normalizing and authorizing. From 1939's Wicked Witch of the East, find the man behind the curtain. There's even a term for the mechanism. The New York Times knows it, and this is its politic title. The politics of distraction. This structuring vision works by distracting with, well, The New York Times calls it shiny objects. White supremacists, bad parents, etc., are those kinds of shiny objects. When media, people, authority start pointing at them, go back to the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Look for the man behind the curtain and pay attention. We're all here this afternoon because we're all doing personal responsibility and good work and change. These are all good, and I encourage and I'm thankful that we are here. We should all of us be good mothers and fathers, those of us who have children, and even when we can. We shouldn't be white supremacists, even if we're not white. What does that all mean? But in some ways, the shiny object in the room, bad parents and evil white supremacists, distracts us from what Eisenhower once called the industrial military complex, or what I term the capitalist colonial complex. The guys, usually, and white, historically, behind the curtain. And on the right, you see a graphic. You see overt white supremacy. Probably can't read it from this particular point. But, you know, it's the things that we all know that are evil and bad and we shouldn't do, and animus and all the kinds of things. And then there is the kind of the subvert white supremacy, and, you know, well, we're doing it, we don't know about it, and so we're just going to say no to that kind of structure for the moment, borrowing from Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, because it's really not about pride or feelings or even about persons or even about white. It's not what you or I feel about being white. We're not white. That's immaterial. So this is how media works with fake news. And clearly I'm borrowing the term fake news from a different context, which is not unimportant to what we're talking about. But images of white supremacy always feature, and there are standard technological ways that which we present, whether they're bad mothers or bad fathers or white supremacists. You know the drill. You can see the narrative coming long before you hear the words. And so images of white supremacy always feature white people in crowds carrying signs. Some, probably many, with skinheads and tattoos. It's a narrative we know, and in fact we expect. The interesting point about this particular image is that it has a woman carrying a sign. And media knows that that's going to catch more attention. So with this kind of narrative expectation, this is why we miss Timothy McVeigh, blonde, blue-eyed Army vet who blew up a federal building in 1995. We weren't looking that direction. It's like whenever a parent, usually a mother, according to the media, kills a child. Personalizing it doesn't help. What structures make motherhood and fatherhood and marriage and economics of child rearing possible in this country? Those are the structures. That's what we're going to be looking at today. Number one, white supremacy. It's a theory of history, not a history of people. A theory of history. This is not about persons in particular, but about how the way his, and it is here in this case, his story has typically worked itself through. And again, to repeat, much of this probably everyone has heard. I will try and be brief through it all, and to the extent that this is old news, I ask you to bear with me. So not so much what is white supremacy, but where is it? Item. White supremacy used in popular discourse to mean individual animus or hate towards individuals or groups who are not white. Governor Northam gets it. He apologized. He likely feels good about that. I recall Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky and this huge cry through the media, apologize, 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 confess, confess, confess. The confession is a social work that in some ways distracts from the actual event that's happening. Submission feels good. Northam confesses. He says, you know what, I was a young, ignorant person. I feel good about apologizing. So the confession is more about him. But in this case, he is the shiny object. Item: a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, and in which white dominance and non-white subordination exists across a broad array of institutions and social settings. We don't like hearing those kinds of things, and we bristle and we raise our tempers. But so what are we talking about? What institutions? What social settings? Go ahead, pull the curtain. So the definition. Systemic racism includes the complex array of practices, the unjustly gained political economic power of one denomination of people, the continuing economic and other resource inequalities along race lines, and the ideologies and attitudes created to maintain and rationalize white privilege and power. If this were my ethics class, my students would have already put their pens down and pulled out their phones thinking I'm not looking. Systemic here means core race-structured systems are manifest in each of society's major parts: economy, politics, education, religion, the family. All reflect the fundamental reality of systemic racism. So let's look at the system, the race gravitational lines, the ideology, the archaeology, if you want, of race dominance. By definition, unreflected and not visible. The structures that might be called a point of view. Some very quick definitions. And this is kind of the grammar behind feelings, and feelings do have grammar. Feelings are organized like emotions, and they're organized in a grammar of meaning. There's the ideology of what we call white supremacy, or any other kind, but in this case white. White people are culturally, biologically superior to all other people. Just to advance the thought, this is the content of Immanuel Kant, Thomas Jefferson, Locke, and continental philosophy. This is how enlightenment structured the world. White supremacy, the political system. Exclusion of non-whites from voting rights, land ownership, labor protections, full participation in public institutions and services, political representation, and the protection of the courts. There are 4 nations who are constitutionally set up in this way. Structured racism, the contemporary framework of legal white supremacy, a legally sanctioned system of racially inequitable social and political relations. And lastly, white nationalism, an ideology that proposes to exclude people of color from society. Some factions propose using genocidal racial cleansing to secure a white state. And to advance an argument, this can be done bureaucratically as well. What are we talking about? The legal foundations of white supremacy, just at random here is a 2018 from a respected university and a respected journal, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This paper focuses on a very important part of white supremacy, the legal foundations. The central thesis of this paper is that American law has historically played a vital role in constructing white supremacy. While America has eliminated overt race-conscious laws that favor whites, the law continues to play a critical role in maintaining white supremacy today. We will see this headline again. The citizens of Alabama declare for white supremacy and purity of ballot as they rewrote their Constitution. Axiom: behind and beneath, supporting, giving voice, and authorizing any act of civil violence. And if you hear echoes of 1933 and as the Nazi regime came through Germany, you understand. Behind and beneath, supporting and giving voice and authorizing any act of civil violence rests some authority or power, personal or legal or custom. So, behind the curtain, along with say their names, let's do a read the laws. On the left, from the city and Congress that brought us the Naturalization Act of 1790, the very first thing the new United States Congress did, Congress number 1, within months, be it enacted by the House and Senate of Representatives of the United States, that any alien being a free white person, and so on. So you understand this. The United States is one of the 4 countries nationally constituted by its constitution to be white only. I'm sorry to say that, that's what the law states. The citizens of Alabama declare for white supremacy and purity of ballot. The putrid sore of Negro suffrage is severed from the body politic of the Commonwealth. Okay, this is law. This is the rewriting in 1990 of the, 1900 of the Alabama Constitution. The Constitutional Convention was called with the intention by Democrats of the state, quote, within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in this state. That's from the Constitution itself. White is not a color, it's a structure. It's a grammar of social discourse. This is what it looks like in law. This is how law, even bad laws, conform social practice. All right, take a pause for a second. South Africa, and we always know and hate South Africa and throw rocks at their apartheid. South Africa and the United States were founded by settler colonialists. We'll talk about that. Both nations instituted enslavement as a system of economics. It's true, they did. The economics later provided convincement for a social economics. It's true, that did too. And suddenly a lot of folks in the colonies began to change their mind on what they thought about enslavement. Well, you know what, it's not so bad. In fact, it's probably a very good thing for certain kinds of people. You know where I'm going with all this. You've seen it, you've read it. A settler colonist is someone who came and comes from a different country and stays. It's not we're coming to a country, we're going to send back cotton and sugar, we're coming back in here, and you, the people, as well as the cotton, have to leave. Whether the word is Lebensraum, Nazi Germany, or manifest destiny. The point is to eliminate the people and assume the resources. When Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963 said that genocide, that our country was probably one of the few countries that performed genocide as a federal policy, he's not lying, and he's one of the only few people at the time who was speaking it. Through the middle late 20th century, both nations kept apartheid from the Afrikaans apartness. South Africa implemented legislation and institutionalized segregation. The United States implemented similar legal measures through what we call Jim Crow. Now, from this point forward, whenever you see the expression Jim Crow, ask yourself, does it say Jim Crow laws? What I've been arguing through a lot of the things that I do with this is that we use the expression Jim Crow because it exempts us from having to think about the legalness of it, that this isn't just feelings and get off the sidewalk. This is a legal structure. Both countries intended by their laws to remove, eliminate, and disenfranchise all persons who are not legally white. And legal is not only a practice, it's also a definition. See the laws. Axiom: apartheid intends to separate white people, not black. Segregation intends to separate white people, not black. So where does it start? Very quickly, I'm sure we know our history. Supreme Court decisions, 1857. Dred Scott, read it. We're not going to read it here. But it essentially says that Negro persons are not citizens and cannot be citizens in this country. The fact that this is 1857, a few years before the Civil War, reminds me that at some point people do have a decision to make about their laws. The Supreme Court declares that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is unconstitutional. We don't ever talk about that in school. It said that Congress lacked the constitutional authority under the 14th Amendment to grant equal protection under the laws to blacks, that only states and local governments could do that. The slaughterhouse cases in 1873, Congress lacks the authority under the 14th Amendment to grant equal protection. The Enforcement Act of 1871, Ku Klux Klan is legal. Goldstone's Inherently Unequal, which is a book that keeps all of this in focus. He argues the court's rulings, quote, opened up a period of de jure racial discrimination that would last almost a century, what is odious as slavery itself. It also threw open the door to a more codified approach to removing African Americans first from the voting rolls and then from mainstream civil life. Some random issues here, and we're talking about, well, this is just simply a Southern issue, and it's not about us in the North, and Jim Crow cars and racial inequity continue to spread due to Plessy versus Ferguson. In one case I didn't even mention because we all know a separate is equal. Well, separate is not equal, it's just separate. Up in the top, one of the most prominent features of the Republican Party predicts that Jim Crow cars will soon be running on the streets of Washington, D.C. He contends that Negroes in that city should give up their seats to white women, even if white men refuse to extend the same courtesy to colored women. If you walk through the streets of Washington, D.C. now, you would see no evidence of this. And I've argued elsewhere that evidence has been erased, archaeologically buried, removed. The image on the far right, Rosa Parks, who got tired of sitting at their bus. Bottom right, no dogs, Negroes, Mexicans. Americans, how do I say it politely, ethnocentrism was not simply limited to one particular group. Oh, by the Rex Theater for colored people, that was Connecticut. State constitutions, who knew this? 1908. By 1908, all 10 states of the former Confederacy had passed new constitutions thanks to the Supreme Court. Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, sometimes bypassing general elections to achieve this. Oh, and I forgot, Nevada, California, those southern states, Kansas, Oregon, that's southern state, California again, Washington state, Ohio. After the Supreme Court ruled against the Civil Rights Act of 1875, every single southern state redrafted its constitution. Ballots were introduced to make it virtually impossible for people with poor reading skills to correctly cast their votes. That's where you get the grandfather clause image. Apartheid laws, and we can't go through this, as there's just too much to do. But from 1880s to the 1960s, a majority of American states, counties, towns, south, north, east, and west, enforced segregation through Jim Crow laws. From Delaware to California, from North Dakota to Texas, states and cities imposed legal punishments on people for playing together, moving or not moving, or living in the wrong place, or consorting with members of another race. The most common types of laws forbade intermarriage and ordered business owners and public institutions to keep their black and white clientele separate. In DC, black codes, Negroes could not fly kites. Go figure. In Alabama, it shall be unlawful for a Negro and white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice or dominoes. Of course, Alabama is a specific case. In Montgomery, for example, 60% of the black Americans lived in the city, but they were forbidden by law to hold jobs in that city. Darkies, bathing prohibited. Jim Crow laws, separate is not equal, it is just separate. So what are we talking about? This is California. And I'm gonna bear with me, but we're just gonna read through. This is California. In this state, Asian immigration produced more legislation against Chinese immigrants than against African. 1850 California statute, no black, mulatto, Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of against a white man. 1854, the Supreme Court, the statute precluded persons of Chinese descent from testifying for or against a white man. California's Constitution stated that no native of China. 1866, 1947, segregation, voting, enacted 17 Jim Crow laws. 1860 through 1880 and 1885, children of Negroes, Mongolians, and Indians must attend separate schools. 1872, alcohol sales prohibited for the sale of liquors to Indians, but this remained legal until 1920. And so on. It makes me crazy just simply reading that. And you know what? That's only half. That's only half. And this is California. So, you're saying, oh, that was then in a galaxy far, far away. Laws still in place. For example, Governor Northam, after his coming out, for example, in the Facebook or in his medical book page, he announces a second report on systemic bias in Virginia law. And he should. He's got some work to catch up with. Commission to examine racially inequity in Virginia law presents new policy recommendations to address vestiges of iniquity. And this is inequality, sorry. This is Virginia. So what kind of laws might Governor Northam be considering as he tries to kind of recoup his, well, I was young and didn't know better moment? This is 1874. The Journal of the House of Delegates, State of Virginia. This is the same year the Civil Rights Act was passed. This is now 9 or 10 years following the Civil War. Quote, henceforth let it be understood of all that the political equality of the races is settled, and the social equality of the races is a settled impossibility. Let it be understood of all that any organized attempt on the part of the weaker and relatively diminishing race to dominate the domestic government is the wildest chimera of political insanity. Let each race settle down in final resignation to the lot to which the logic of events has inexorably consigned it. The Journal of the House of Delegates, the State of Virginia, this is law, 1874, 1875. Or maybe it's this one. We, the white people, race, culture, and the Virginia Constitution of 1902. This is a dissertation. In 1902, in an effort to reestablish what they saw as whites' natural right to control government rule over blacks, the delegates to Virginia's Constitutional Convention, 1901-1902, declared the new constitutional law that they felt reflected its true opinion of the people of Virginia. This thesis argues that Virginia's 1902 Constitution increased the political power of whites and decreased that of black Virginians. And you know, of course, that Virginia, the state of Virginia, when it was told to segregate its schools, chose to close them down. You may not know that fact, but that's history. And as late as 1924, the new Virginia law to preserve racial integrity provided that, quote, white persons were defined as those with, quote, no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, or 1/16 or less of the blood of the American Indian. Virginia's birth registration, not only did you have that particular law, you had to register. Are we in South Africa? No, we are in Virginia. Whites only and bureaucratic genocide. I hereby affirm that I believe the statements on the color of my parents, etc., etc., and this is where you signed, this is where you have your birth and your color. Every person living in Virginia had to register as either white or colored. This designation determined whom a person could marry and where he or she could attend school, among other things. White or colored. What happens to persons who are not white? What happens to the first peoples of Virginia, what we call the Indians? What happens to the mestiza? What happens to many of the persons who, the Hispanic members of the community who are legal citizens? They are erased. This is what I mean by bureaucratic genocide. As someone who has occasion to witness marriages in Virginia, I had to register at a Virginia court. And I had to sign my name to a document that says, I have seen both the bride and the groom period. Now, why is this important? Because until 1967, miscegenation was against the law, not only in Virginia, but in probably 37 states of the Union. Now, they couldn't say that, but Virginia nonetheless could get around the law. So here again. Here's Governor Northam, a 1984 yearbook for Eastern Virginia Medical School. You ask, so why is a racist minstrel tune still recognized in Virginia as the state song emeritus? So the legal work, and we're just now talking law, the legal work and process of making white started a long time ago. First in Virginia, 1705, which establishes then that any non-white person was, quote, real estate, and you can look that law up. With the first Naturalization and Immigration Act, 1790, free white persons, because even then, all white people were not free. They understood that then. If you were Irish, for example, and a servant in this particular country, you were not eligible. So blacks were not the only person at risk, and we need to broaden our conversations around reparations, if you want, or even thinking about these kinds of things, to break down the binary of black and white, because it's much more complicated. When you get to, for example, Texas and California and Oregon and where we got this country from, we see here Make America White again, 2018. Just to finish this section here on the law, in the closet of Jefferson State, racism, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, militia, and the state of Jefferson's Proud Boys. We're going to talk more next week about Mr. Jefferson and the white supremacists and the white nationalists that in this whole particular area, just so that we know ahead that this was land that we took from Mexico, just so we understand what we're talking about there. And before we think that this issue is a legal issue in the South, the term Jim Crow law was first used in 1841 in reference to a Massachusetts law that required railways to provide a separate car for black passengers in the separate but equal doctrine Massachusetts. And the soiling of Old Glory, you see this on 1976 during the Boston busing desegregations, in which a very ambitious person with a pointed American flag is aiming at a person who seems trying to get out of his way. Okay, that's law. The other law, church. The National Cathedral in Washington shows how pervasive this iconography when it dismantled an elaborate set of stained glass windows depicting the Confederate generals Robert Lee and Stonewall Jackson in saintly poses. As the cathedral dean put it, there was no excuse for the nation's most visible church to celebrate a cause whose primary reason for being was the preservation and extension of slavery in America. And I should say that this presentation today, while I have lots of opinions on the Confederacy and that particular politic, this is not about that. That's a different thing. So here you have the two stained glass windows in the church. And understanding from a stained glass window perspective that stained glass windows, if I can put it this way, serve the function of Facebook. In other words, this was the grammar that that most people had the literacy of being able to read. So a stained glass window was a kind of teachment. It was a textbook. It was a way of, you can call it a comic book if you want, but it provided facts in a material culture in a way that persons who, for example, lacked certain kinds of literacies were able to do this, which is why, for example, when you talk to students about essays and movies, you ask them how they liked the movie, they'll say, oh, I liked it. What did you think about the essay? It was hard. The difference between something that is hard and something that is liked. And to understand that the history of natural law, as we understand it, is a church doctrine. So that even when we start pushing back on, I spent the first few minutes of this talking about civil law, but as a matter of fact, civil law emerges out of a constitutional and a kind of an archive of legal processes and laws that essentially was first religious and church. Just some examples of Georgetown and Princeton and Virginia Theological Union, the Society of Jesus, Franciscans and the missions, for example, and all of their way of both way they handled persons and are coming to some sense of reparations for that. Right. And Columbus's contracts, it stipulated from the Queen that he would receive 10% value, quote, for any enslaved Indian. That his word, that he brought back to Queen Isabella. But so that institutions that once, like the National Cathedral, have wrapped themselves in Confederacy ideology without consequences have been put on notice, this is the Washington Post, that public sentiment has shifted. And the next few slides focus specifically on white supremacy and the historical roots in U.S. Christianity. Just one quote. Ladies and gentlemen, for 15 years, I've had the privilege of being pastor for White Baptist Church. If we stand 100 years from now, it will still be a white church. I'm a believer in separation of the races. I am nonetheless a Christian. If you want to get into a fight with the one that started the separation of races, then you come face to face with your God. The difference in color, the difference in our body, our minds, our life, our mission on this earth is God-given. I should say here he is paraphrasing Thomas Jefferson. And I want you to see here, these are, it's like, a consumer's first guide to a certain kind of book, and you see this in, say, Amazon, for example, or to, you see carts in the grocery stores, the consumer's training cart. These little people are raised up as they are. And the longer conversation that I'm having here is about civilization, Christianity, and commerce. And Jan H. Bohr of the Sudan Mission says, colonialism is a form of imperialism based on a divine mandate and designed to bring liberation, spiritual, cultural, economic, and political. And we don't have the time to have a conversation that's adequate to the topic, except to notice that there's no particular secret about, I'll say it this way, in terms of the Catholic Church's missions of all sorts, from Portugal and Spain and the various other sorts of places, that always brought along the Christian doctrine and the wing. And the point of the mission was essentially to evangelize. And one can see over here on the left the image about how what colonialism was doing for its people. But more to the point, to us here in the United States, Henry Hammond, 1858. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand. A race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. Again, he's practically quoting Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. We use them for our purpose and call them slaves. So what follows here is going to be a brief walk through colonial, settler colonialism, Christianity, and manifest destiny as it plays out in the United States. Westward, the course of empire takes away this famous image in Congress, 1861. What you're going to see over here is the creche, mother, father, the cross, and you see westward going the empire, and you see as the shade on the native Indians fades away. But the most influential ideology is manifest destiny. The ideology of manifest destiny dates itself back to colonialism, when colonists believed that they would be the example for the rest of the world. You hear Puritans, Winthrop talking about City on a Hill. You hear President Ronald Reagan quoting that. We shall be a city on the hill, and everybody shall be looking at us. Then the question that Winthrop began to figure out is, what happens when people are not paying attention to you? Americans believed they were destined by God to remake the world. A point I'm making currently in a class on history and mythology is this kind of manifest destiny is not simply limited to one particular country. One can open the newspaper right now, probably you have in the last couple of minutes, to see that the quest for, what do you want to call it, manifest destiny, Lebensraum, national origins, that particular conversation is not ended. And again, I don't want to push the Christianity thing, but I do want to underestimate that there are links here, and at least a kind of historical gravity that links religious practices, even folk religious practices, and I call them small r, that one does not have to be a Christian to think like this, but there is much of a sort of Christian attitude, a Christian set of mind that is sedimented into the way a particular culture thinks. Again, Washington Post, racism among white Christians is higher than among non-religious. No coincidence. The image to the right or to the left is interesting. This is the morning of January 6th, 2020. This is the Capitol coup setup, if you want, and in Huck Signas Vinces, in this sign conquer. These are the two structures, law and church, that make possible the practices of social apartheid. They're background noise. We don't pay attention to them. We can talk about we're not political, we're not religious. We're just ourselves. We're liberal persons, and we want to do good things. They make this invisibility to the men and women behind the curtain, mostly men, practices of social apartheid. But here are the systems whose rigidity is rarely visible until you stop. The Underwriter's Mortgage Handbook, and we're going to look at each of these for a second. Advertising, sports, education, medicine, Confederate memorials, incarceration. 1938, Underwriting Manual, neighborhood classifications. Green were new homogeneous areas, still desirable areas. Yellow were neighborhoods were definitely declining. D, red, areas in which things take place in 3 had already happened. Black and low-income neighborhoods were considered to be the worst for lending. The Underwriting Manual of the Federal Housing Administration. Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. You can't live on a block where you could not marry. That was 1938. This is this week. Bloomsburg study. Wells Fargo denied more than half of black homeowners mortgage refinancing while approving 72% of white applicants. Bloomberg used federal mortgage data to analyze the situation. Wells Fargo says that, quote, other credit-related factors, quote, attributed to the numbers. More than half of black applicants rejected. 72% of white applicants approved. This is what redlining looks like in a city in which I lived. And those of you who know Oakland, Berkeley, this, of course, is the hill in the residential area, and this is the area down along the waterfront. Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, I've Forgotten the History of How Our Government Segregated America. Medicine. I can't go through all of this, just to say, 2012 study found that predominantly black zip codes were 67% more likely to have a shortage of primary care physicians. 2016 study, many white medical students believe black people have a higher pain threshold than white. Thomas Jefferson did, he said that. Of all the participants, 73% held at least one false belief about biological differences between races. 2015, lower life expectancy, higher blood pressure, lower rates of vaccination. Many of these factors, people will apologize and say, well, it's because I can't afford it, or there's this, or there's that. There is all of that too, yes. To go to something perhaps less necessary than medicine. Oscar nominations for the past decade. 89% of nominations went to white people. 71% of nominations went to men. Another way of looking at this, and we know these are old, I'm capsulizing arguments that we heard and we've seen. Over the past decade, the Academy gave 74 total nominations, past decade, to persons of color. In 2011 alone, it gave 72 nominations for white creatives, less than 1 year. 2022, 2009. 28.8% of the nominations in the top categories went to women. Oh, yay, and you think, yay, well, you've come a long way, lady. 679 nominations, 71.1% went to men. Sports, I'm going to move quickly through this. 18% of NFL head coaches have been people of color since 2011. In 2021, 71% of the NFL players were persons of color. 18% head coaches, 71% people of color. Winter Olympics. Of the close to 3,000 total athletes in 2018 Winter Olympics, 43 were black. A recent decision by the International Olympic Committee likely reduced the potential number of black athletes at the 2022 Games. And if you want to go back even a month or two, you can recall the narratives of how some specific individuals were were not allowed to play. The Olympics continue to prevent top black athletes from competing. And there's all kinds of reasons. Yes, well, they did this and they did that, and we need to do this. But still, just saying. Race and incarceration. The graphic will tell you. Incarceration rates 2019. Black, Asian, white, Black, American Indian, white, Hispanic, Asian. Black, American Indian, white, Hispanic, Asian. Americans are imprisoned at a rate of 349 per 100,000 residents, Latino. White, non-Latino, 261 per 100,000. Black, 1.1240 per 100,000 residents. And you can say, this is just an observation. And this is just, well, you know what? Yes, there's this many young black persons and this many white persons that are being incarcerated. Well, it's just the way it is. Well, okay. Confederate Memorial Fountain. I'm just kind of pausing this one in here because I think it's very curious that this is Montana and this is AD 1916. And what is there a Confederate monument doing in Montana in 1916? Its original installation correlated in time to an increase in the activity of the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations, including increased activity in Helena. It was renovated again in 1971 and as recently as 2018. A loving tribute to our Confederate soldiers, again, Helena, Montana, 1916, by the Daughters of the Confederacy in Montana, 1916. The issue of the Daughters of the Confederacy is a fascinating discussion on how gender itself props up supremacy. So we're going to close this section. There's a lot here, and probably makes your head hurt, makes my head hurt. The issue is not who are the white supremacists and what are the terrible things they're doing. That's all terrible and bad, and again, but those are the shiny objects. So the question remains, in what kind of world does race denomination maintain itself? Domination maintains itself. And we looked at some of the various kinds of ways, and every one of us sitting here can say, well, that's not I get stopped by the police and get tickets, and I do this and I do that. Understand. But this is what we're talking about when they talk about race denomination, domination, and we talk about how structures have a certain kind of gravity and cultures have a certain kind of materiality to them, and that it's not simply words in a book. And so then one wants to ask the case, what are supremacists for? So Daenerys Targaryen would understand 1,500 years of white dominion for their own good. In 1899, Kipling writes this, "The white man's burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands." What had the United States done? The United States had invaded the Philippines. As the United States invaded the Republic of Hawaii, as the United States tried to invade Canada on 4 different occasions. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go send your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To walk in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. I'm sorry to read this and think of the Ukraine. A different conversation. If this had been in the mid-90s in a different country, in a different part of the world, the argument would be different. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly preferred laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come now to search your manhood. And again, a conversation still remains to think about how the rigid structures of gender, despite our liberal sense of that we're now better than that, still locks down white supremacists. This second section, colonialism and the raced modern state, and we may not get through everything I wanted to try and do today, but I'm going to forge ahead. So where to start? How did the thinking about how we got here? And I will again say that much of this is going to be fairly abstract, and so if you want to go out for smoke, you can. So 20 years after the development of structural race as a perspective, and you can call it critical race theory, you can call it a lot of different things. But what's missing is a framework that explores race and racism as a modern global project. We talk about race as simply something that happens in the United States. It's race and it's completely domestic. It's not. That it's a project that takes shape differently in diverse structural and ideological forms, but it's based on what we're going to call a global white supremacy, or what I'm calling that. So what do I mean by this? Matters of race are usually addressed as domestic. And if you hear that word and you keep thinking about, well, it's a women's issue because it's simply domestic, that's kind of dismissal I'm talking about. That is, it's questions of identity, of who I want to be and how I'm free about it. And if I, like some particular woman did about 10 years ago, claim a kind of ethnicity that is not mine, then everybody gets all into, gets their selves up and around about that. Or in terms of stratification, the different distributions of rewards and resources within a country, which I just did. That's exactly how I handled this, was that how in this particular society, this is what the facts showed. And it was not simply in terms of racialized identities, but also in terms of how the structure blends and bends toward a certain gendered dynamic. So while these are both fundamentally important, they often neglect the international processes through which race and racial differences have been produced. Colonial histories are constitutive of the force of modern states. So this is kind of my point for this whole thing. The word nation, as its modern usage implies, was effectively born in colonial, raced, quote, white civilization bias. The state, in an age of raced empire, and you can go back to Sir John Hawkins and Queen Elizabeth I, or you can go back to the Portuguese in 1444, and as they kidnapped a boatload of African nationals, Ghanaian, I think, and back to Portugal. But it was in the interaction between these two different persons that suddenly one needed to do an apology for why we are doing this to this particular person, why Hawkins could bring back to Queen Elizabeth I and say, well, these kinds of people are not really people because they are this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The first time the word white appears in any kind of printed form is in 1613. Because before that, you were what, Portugal, you were Spanish, you were British, you were whatever the thing you might have been. You would certainly have been a Christian. For the first few decades of its history, empire was explicitly occupied with questions of colonial administration and the justification of racial supremacy. Hence, this notion with the Enlightenment and Kant's categories of the human, which are gendered and which are raced and which are what's all rational. Can you read and can you think and can you process? Of course, these are colonial bureaucratic tools that are necessary. And on Kant and Enlightenment, sometimes see the New York, just Google Kant and Enlightenment in the New York Times if you want a quick study. So social scientists furnish legitimacy for a world structured by imperial exploitation and pseudoscience and pseudo-racial hierarchies. Polygenesis was the excuse given to support enslavement, that we could and should. You saw this with Senator Hammond. With the race of people that was given to us, they're docile, they're quiet, they're fun-loving, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We hear this about Hispanic and Latin folks, for example. We hear this about certain kinds of folks, and again, I'm using Western terminology to understand that the way that the West is always at the center of the discussion about how other peoples are failing us. So the race became the basic unit of politics, more fundamental than state, society, nation, or individual. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900 memorably declares that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. The world, in a sudden emotional conversion, has discovered that it is white, and by that token, wonderful. No accident that America's quest into empire with the Philippines, with Spain, with Hawaii, with the other 16 kind of territories that it has, is all at the same time. The scramble for Africa from 1885 through 1910. It's the white people to the rescue. So Du Bois is one of the first theorists to chart the change in relations from a de jure to de facto forms of white supremacy. So not only is it now law, it is the new religion, what he calls, of whiteness. So in 2020, foreign policy gets it right. Why is mainstream international relations blind to racism? They're right, the editor is right. Ignoring the central role of race and colonialism in world affairs precludes an accurate understanding of the modern state system. This is British in India. Back to my first slide. Invasion, colonialism is not an event. It's a structure. 500 years of European colonialism in one animated map. I'll play this again, but I want you to notice that these first four, England, France, Portugal, and Spain, these first four, so why is this important? Colonialism is brutally nasty business. One estimate suggests that from 1885 to 1908, when I was just talking about the scramble for Africa, Belgian King Leopold II, occupation of the Congo, killed 8 million people. One scholar who spends his life estimating state-perpetrated atrocity puts the 20th century death toll attributable to colonialism at 50 million, behind only the Soviet Union and Communist China in total killed. This is, again, to come back to the topic of the Ukraine. This is a backdrop for the kind of nationalism that we hear this, oh, thank God the wicked witch is dead, that all this stuff is over and past. It's not. European colonialism has been around for hundreds of years, and if we now call it the World Bank and the new global view, there is that. In Totovika, in Hak Signes Vinci. So Redeemer nations, holy wars, cities built on hills, Deus Vult. This is language. This is not Islam. This is Deus Vult is Pope Urban II in 1196, beginning the Crusades. It's God chooses it. The concept of exceptionalism and religious nationalism is, of course, not limited to the United States. But just to put quickly a couple texts and books on the recent topic, if you're interested on this. And you kind of look, even as you scan images of this, if you were to say, just go scan colonialists in a Google image search, even the way the images are set up shows you the power dynamics at work. Are Christian theorists thinking about this stuff? Sure they are. Our mission after George Floyd on white supremacy, colonialism, and world Christianity. We are all, whether it's Georgetown or Princeton or the Jesuits or the Franciscans, all of us who wear that Christian hat, and I name myself as one of them, are in the business now of trying to reconstruct and reconstitute, and if you want to do it, do some kind of reparative or restorative justice for the way in which, like Governor Northam, I didn't know any of this stuff. I was a kid. Well, so the question of knowledge is not what you did when you didn't know. What does one do when one has it? What's interesting here is that even the roots of slavery, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and capitalism, it is so saturated with Christianity that we're now even looking at using the word from the Christian Bible to define it. Moving along, the new age of empire, how colonialism and racism still support and rule the world. It challenges the grand narratives of the Enlightenment Western linear progress and offers a broader and more complete picture of the continuing problems of racism, the imperial mentality that generates neocolonialist and post-racial orders. The imperial mentality. I don't mean to keep pushing that particular point. So one wonders, well, if I'm looking at CNN, or if I'm reading the New York Times, or I'm reading the Washington Post, I don't ever hear things about the Washington U.S. Empire State and white supremacy. But remember that the U.S. became the U.S. first by establishing territories, which by and large, I'm sorry to say it this kind of way, they took away from other people. And you can go back to the Declaration of Independence when Jefferson was trying to drum up support for the people on, quote, the frontiers against the savages, quote, end quote. Most cases, these became states. Hawaii, 1898, actually Hawaii was in 1893, when it was first, there's no other way to say this, it was taken to the Republic of Hawaii. There was a coup by American businessmen because they wanted the product. 1893 to 1993, Bill Clinton, you may recall, apologized for that. It didn't give Hawaii back to the Republican, but it did apologize. Currently, the U.S. holds 16 territories. What do these mean? Again, just the point of it that we are in the business of increasing our land in the way that other people are. But the Philippines and Canada, there's a hilarious narratives of the 4 times that U.S. persons attempted to do some kind of end run or coup, or in Canada, Central America, Colonial, which is a place that American liberalists were thinking of rehoming, if I can use that word, Black Americans that were freed. Colonial was going to be a blacks-only congregation, capital, city, nation in what we would now call Colombia. The Confederacy attempted on a number of occasions to send persons to different countries in South America to extend the enslaved states. We took half of Mexico from them in 1848 for that particular reason, under Polk. Examples of U.S. empire: the Philippines, Hawaii, Mexico, Vietnam, the scramble for Africa. This is Honolulu. Secret debate on U.S. seizure of Hawaii revealed. Peace treaty is ratified. Awful slaughter. This is Portugal. Not Portugal. This is Manila. Thomas Jefferson. People laugh. Yes, I do have opinions on this man. Will not a lover of natural history, then, one who views the gradations in all the races of animals with the eye of philosophy, excuse an effort to keep those in the department of man as distinct from nature as nature has formed them? This unfortunate difference of color, and perhaps of faculty, is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. This unfortunate difference of color, which is a positive thing, in the sense of positive, he says it there, he doesn't hesitate over it. And then perhaps of faculty. Jefferson was always someone who was very cagey about what he put into print. Manifest Destiny and Settler Colonialism, there are books yet to be written on this particular. Jefferson: if we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we'll never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. Well, that's okay for Mr. Jefferson when he said that, because then he later, when he, again, for the extension of enslavement, made the Louisiana Purpose, he removed that land from the indigenous persons also. Washington, General: the immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. I want to pause here, because if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson talks about that only the savage Americans conduct warfare this way, well, it will be essential to ruin their crops now on the ground and prevent their planting more. Roosevelt. I don't go so far to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, Roosevelt said during January 1886. And then he said, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. Lincoln, the Homestead Act in 1862, which took the Indian Territory, Oklahoma, and basically opened it up to the land grab. Oklahoma was under land treaty, remember, to the Cherokee, after they had been moved once. What does one do with this kind of information? Well, clearly, we don't teach it in school, and we don't pay much attention because we don't, faced against the enormities of one's own history. So white privilege, Washington didn't say this, Jefferson didn't say this, Roosevelt didn't exactly say this, but it's what their words intended. And we move forward to 2020, I'm going to do this largely next week, but when we start thinking about specifically white nationalism, which is different than white supremacy, nationalism and supremacy are two different sorts of things, and there are other separatist states and ethno-nationalist states that are not white. It's a different issue here. But white nationalism is a type of nationalism or pan-nationalism which espouses the belief that white people are a race and seeks to develop and maintain racialized national identity, which is going to be more or less the topic for next week. But many of its proponents identify with and are attached to the concept of a white nation or white ethno-state. All right, I'm gonna come back here if I can, really, just to show you. Sorry, where did it go? Well, I can't find it. I wanted to go back to the 51st state of Jefferson. Well, I can't find it. It's okay. Global history, the eye of the colonial. And in these finishing slides for today, this is my undercurrent, that any concept of global history is almost by definition white history, and I'm going to encourage that we reuse or rethink that particular expression of global history, that we need a different word for that. The UN chief, white supremacy is a global threat. The images from the US Capitol, and this was the UN chiefs, this was the image of and this is from The Guardian. So my questions are, even the use of, quote, global begs the question. Any camera shows the colonial view. Should we be saying Anglo-colonial? Perhaps better to say manifest destiny and white empire. And again, we'll be doing more of this particular next week, but I wanted to see here this notion of white supremacy groups like the National Socialist Movement in an Arkansas rally in 2018, The Economist, why white nationalist terrorism is a global threat. There are lots of different issues here, and the point that the FBI is now beginning to make is that white nationalism is the worst domestic threat to safety in the United States. And to come back to the point that much of this is a reaction to the fact that the persons who, like the McMurray building in Oklahoma City in 1995, we missed that. That wasn't on anyone's particular, quote, radar at that particular point. And so the larger question here is, you have ethnicity, you have supremacy, and you have terrorism, and you have that there's some kind of ethno-fear, fright that's being developed. The Economist, Toward a Global History of White Supremacy. Anglo-Saxonism at the turn of the 20th century, again, we're back to W.D. Du Bois. U.S. elites shared with British imperialists a discourse of English racial heritage towards Anglo-Saxonism. Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, in his poem addressed to the United States. The United States may feel that it came into empire making late, although it didn't, but you'll notice that it was catching up. It was used to subjugate the indigenous Americans, subordination of African Americans, the possession of the United States' own overseas empires. And you can go back to the trauma of Puerto Rico in a recent hurricane and how it was dealt with by the Federals. And according to Anglo-Saxonism, white Protestant English-speaking men, usually men, naturally made modern nations. This racialized modernity is based on the presumption that only whites can govern, and the empowerment of non-whites is therefore an existential threat to white self-government. Go back to the Enlightenment. Go back to Kant, go back to Locke, go back to the thinkers and the presumptions and the content of the material that we are still teaching in our particular schools. And again, the question is why should the United States, now 300 years going, still be using as its philosophical introduction a system of philosophy that I think is not helpful to the students that we're teaching. And the images we know. White nationalist terrorism is a global threat. Trump's victory inspired the Christchurch killer, praises the US president, quote, as a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose. And again, we're going to do more of this next week. The White Australia policy, White Australia. Keep Australia white. 1900, Australia, the white man's island, land. History of nationalism, policing the police. This is something, for example, and to kind of begin to bring a lot of this to a close for today, what we will be talking about next week specifically in terms of law enforcement and what they call ghost skins and the way that a certain kind of thinking makes it possible for a certain kind of person to want to assume civil power. The Nazification of the German police in 33 to 39. So we can learn these particular lessons, and there is a history that the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol exposed extreme elements in U.S. law enforcement, an issue that Germany has long, and other places have long struggled with, France and Germany and even Britain. Beginning in 1933, the Nazi took control of and subsequently transformed the police forces of the Weimar Republic into instruments of state repression and eventually of genocide. Keeping America colonial, again. Whiteness isn't a color, it's a practice. This is a Coke's ad in the 1950s. This is on a machine. It's on a Coke machine. White ethnostates by constitution, there are 4. South Africa, Australia, United States, actually there's 7. New Zealand, Nazi Germany, Rhodesia. White ethnostates by constitution. South Africa, Australia, United States, New Zealand, Nazi Germany, Rhodesia. Being enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States, any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. Truth and advertising, of course, this has changed somewhat legally. But European exceptionalism, what we're calling westward, the course of not yet empire, again, this is a clear image, and you can see the crash and you can see the cross. The colonialist weapon was a geographical imaginary and a politic of extermination. this, I mean, see the Declaration of Independence. So this notion of what I'm calling this ethno-fear, this notion of that I'm depriving, that I'm vanishing. We used to use this expression for the vanishing Indian, but as a matter of fact, it's the American that was vanishing. So you have this drum thumping, America First by Wilson, and you can do your own homework on Mr. Wilson. It's not about a specific group of persons, although it is predominantly non-white. Nor is this anxiety of white loss new. Washington Post, War of Races, how hateful ideology echoes through American history. Through the Reconstruction and black voting rights in particular, you'd hear this notion that you can't do this because it would have a trigger of a war of the races. Jefferson's notes on Virginia, he actually says that these two peoples, once they are free, could not live together because it would result in an extermination of one or the other. Now, this, as I've said in other places, that particular line is excerpted from his, actually it's erased from the memorial in D.C. So you have the White Man's League, you have Redeemer Nation governments, you have Christianity and Confederacy. So again, Hammond over here to the left, this notion that the Confederacy was formed, defined a race to be inherently submissive, qualified in temper, vigor, docility. She could stand the climate and all the purposes. We use them for our purpose and we call them slaves. Alexander Stevens, the VP Confederacy. Our new government's foundation are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. Does that sound like Virginia's House of Burgesses? The slavery subordination to the superior rate is its natural and normal condition. This is the vice president. This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men. Andrew Johnson. This is the president, yes, of the United States and of the Confederacy. Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, we have a long history of scapegoating Asian citizens. And I pointed out to California, for example, as an example. And the issue of the legalness of white. We saw this with the law in Virginia. So the notion, for example, and if you Googled a study on Columbus Day, you'll see that how Columbus Day was essentially a mechanism by which Italians could be redeemed and resurrected back into a situation where they would be seen as citizens. That whiteness was not something that was given to everybody. That whiteness is a practice, but it's also a set of legal doctrines. When white nationalism starts at the executive level and race isn't the only issue. Eleanor Roosevelt once bluntly told a Jewish cabinet member, quote, "You know this is a Protestant country and the Catholics and Jews are here under sufferance." All right, it can't happen here. So to repeat where this first section has gone, I tried to spend a lot of time with colonialism and the way that a certain kind of mindset that is a theory of history, that certain kinds of persons who were at that particular point European, they would not have been called white, but in the drive towards the colonies, in the drive towards capitalism, in the drive toward the greed for empire, began to find justification and a way to think about these other persons as labor, essentially. An enormous portrait of George Washington here hangs across swastika banners and New York flags, American flags at New York's Madison Square Garden. This is in 1939, during a pro-American rally in Madison Square Garden. Okay. So next week, Robert, the natives are restless, colonialism, white supremacy, and the capital coup. So next week, we will start here very briefly and then talk more about white supremacy, law enforcement, ghost skins, how the history of the U.S. Law enforcement starts really in 1704 in North Carolina South Carolina with the slave patrols. And then we will move more directly into an overview of the last 30 or 40 years of white nationalist, white separatist groups, and end at the Capitol coup. And Robert, that's what I have.
Awesome, thank you. So it's not on our calendar yet, but because it's such a potentially big event, I think you should tell people about the walking tour you're going to do in Washington, D.C. in mid-April,
Oh,
if you don't mind.
of course.
Not on our official calendar yet, but maybe Ed can give us a sneak preview.
For those of you who've been following some of the material that I do, I have 9 or 10 webinars, thank you to Robert, on enslaved. And one of them, the first one was Enslaved, District of Columbia, 1790 through 2020. And it's precisely some of that language I was talking about here today. And I want on April 16th, which is Emancipation Day, Saturday, Emancipation Day. And emancipation in the United States is a gradual process. There were 2 or 3 legal emancipation proclamations, one of which, the first one in DC, was with compensation for the slaveholder, but this was not Lincoln. So we'll start on April 16th, Emancipation Day in the district. We're going to meet at the door of the Smithsonian Institution, and essentially we're going to have a 2-hour walk, around the area that would have been the enslaved district for DC business in Washington, DC. That's April 16th, and we're going to be meeting at 1 o'clock at the front of the Smithsonian Castle.
Yeah, and that's not on our calendar just yet, but I'll email everyone that signed up for today's program, and perhaps you can come down and meet Ed in person. So there were quite a few questions and comments, as you can expect. Let's see. The first one, this was from really early in the program, about 15 minutes in. Someone said, what are the 4 nations that were mentioned on the second bullet point regarding the definitions of white supremacy? I'm not sure if...
I did that in SI. It was New Zealand, United States, Australia, Rhodesia, and South Africa.
Okay. And then someone says...
Robert, these are by constitution.
Okay.
By their originating constitution.
Okay. And then someone asks, I'm not being facetious, but what keeps us from sinking into despair about all this?
We keep showing up and trying to do better.
And then let's see. Oh, and then as Edward mentioned, so part 2 will be tomorrow, or sorry, not tomorrow. It's going to be the same time next week, but we're going to do something different. We're going to use the exact same Zoom link for next week, so you can just hold on to that. Usually we have different Zoom links for the different programs, but we're going to try and make it as easy as possible. So we'll be using the same exact Zoom link for next time. Let's see. Hold on 1 second. Someone said, it is so easy to pass judgment in hindsight, to be self-righteous, to take things out of context. You and I are evolved, educated. Greed is an unfortunate aspect of human nature, unfortunately. More of a comment than a question. Let's see.
And while Robert is looking, I want to thank everyone for being part of the good work that we're doing. Thank you.
Someone asked this, you kind of talked about this earlier, so I'm not sure if they got a satisfactory answer, but can you explain again the difference between the American nationalism? Let's see, I'm trying to read. Sometimes people type long questions and I have to sort through it. What's the difference between white nationalism and American nationalism? I think is their question.
Well, and we're going to do more of that particular next week, but white is a racialized form of ethnography, and American, as I'm sure we know, is kind of a made-up fantasy world that includes the United States, it includes Canada, it includes Latin America. So it's a very confusing word, America, so I don't try to use that.
Okay. Let's see.
I mean, you've seen, I think what you're seeing with the Capitol coup, for example, and we'll talk this next week, is a kind of a melding of what we'd call white nationalism and American nationalism. So you're trying to see where a racialized political identity, not unlike South Africa.
And then here's kind of a question that we get frequently in these programs. Is the situation here different or the same as in Canada?
I'm not sure what the situation would be, but it's different. Different, in other words, Canada has a much more developed, much more nuanced policy for its First Nations and its First Peoples. So that's a different issue entirely. So in
Mhm.
some senses, the Canadian ethos has always been better about thinking about the different mix of persons and the way that the colony of Canada was set up. There was never any exclusivity in terms of the founding persons of it. For example, so it was never all one French. It was never one British. So there's a greater sense of melding is a word. If it has an issue, and if it gets politically, it's about the First Nations and the First Peoples. We ignore that. We pay no attention at all to Indians, quote Indians. We say that we do, but we don't do a very good job of that. But even as I said in Virginia, where you are born either white or black, period,
Mhm.
and that's a state law in Virginia.
Yeah, Canada is really fascinating because we have so many similarities with our neighbors up north, but yet so many differences as well. Someone asked if the slides can be made available. So I don't think there's like an easy way to do that, but if we'll put the recording, the YouTube recording, well, this program will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, but it probably won't be uploaded till tomorrow or Monday because we have a full weekend of events.
And Robert, please put persons in contact with me should they have a conversation or wish to have a bibliography, or because what I'm trying to do is simply make evident material that's out there that one might have to look for to see, but one can learn this material.
Mhm. Okay, and let's see. Got a comment from Lisa. Please consider a program specifically for educators that can be historically clear about American education.
Oh, good luck with that. We're actually going to be talking next week about white colonialism, white separatism, and education and book burning. So wait for that.
Okay. And then someone asked, will part 2 next week be recorded? Yes, we'll definitely do that. Let's see. And then, as I said, the program next week, part 2, be the same time, same place. We're going to use the same Zoom link. So you can just hold on. I mean, I'll email it out as well, but you can just hold on to it and we'll use that one again. So, well, I think that's a wrap for the questions and the comments. Edward, thank you so much, as usual, for your awesome insight and sharing your knowledge with us. Really done an amazing job of going on this journey with us and sharing all this knowledge and making us aware of these difficult but important topics, so we're more informed on what's going on. So thank you very much.
Robert, it's
Any
a pleasure. Thank you to DC Culture and History. Thank you.
Awesome. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Uh, we love you and the work that you do, and it is easy to be in despair over this. Each day we get better by doing what we do.
Mm-hmm. And if you're in Washington, D.C., happy cherry blossoms.
And if you're in Washington, D.C., see you on April 16th.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Stay safe.